Hello and welcome back to One Piece of Insight. In today's video, we will be estimating the number of cases opened from every set from OP01 to OP05 and EB01, as well as estimating the population of some of the most expensive cards in those sets, so that we can answer the question of not just how hard to pull is a card, but how rare is it actually compared to all of the other sets that we might want to buy a card from. Now, before we jump into the methodology, I want to be clear about something. This is an estimate. I wanted to do this analysis to see if I could learn something useful, and I was pleasantly surprised by how the results seemed to be consistent across different sets. But by no means is this a perfect indication of how many cases have been opened. These are my estimates from a data analysis I did. They are not from Bandai or anything of that sort. So please, as always, take this with a grain of salt that you can use to inform your decisions that you make, but please don't go out and buy things specifically because I said one set is rarer than another. So with that, let's jump right into the analysis. Now, I want to start by saying that I am going to walk you through a tiny little bit of math to help you understand what it exactly is we're doing here. I promise, stick with me. It will make sense. So in order to estimate the number of cases opened, we identified the percentage of serialized cards that have been graded. So then once we figured that out, we calculated the total BGS and PSA population of the most expensive card in every set that we wanted to look at. And then based off that, we estimated the population of those cards. Once we had an estimated population of cards, we divided by the pull rates to estimate the print run. I promise I'm going to show you exactly what I did in 2 slides. But first, let's talk about the serialized cards. The fundamental problem that we have when we look at PSA and BGS data is we don't know what percentage of the total population of cards have been submitted to be graded. However, we are able to solve this problem by looking at serialized cards because, unlike regular cards, where Bandai doesn't tell us how many there are, we know exactly how many of serialized cards there are. And so we looked at the percentage of total cards that have been graded by PSA and BGS for each of 4 serialized cards. Then I took an average of that, which came out to 55%, and this is what we're essentially going to use as our benchmark for looking at other cards in different sets. And so here's exactly what I did. So I started with the total PSA and BGS population of the Shanks manga from OP01, which was 2,674. Then, because the average was 55%, and I think that these cards are probably likely to be graded at a little bit less of a rate than the serialized cards, because those are more expensive and more rare, I downgraded it to 50%. So I divided by 0.5. So my estimate is that there are 5,348 of these Shanks that have been opened so far. So then, to calculate print run, we took that estimated population, and again, we divided it by the pull rate that we calculated in the previous videos, which in this case was 0.33. Since you anticipate pulling one of these mangas every 3 cases, to give us a total of 16,200 OP01 cases approximately that have been opened. All right, so I know we started talking about Romance Dawn, so here we have the population of the estimated number of Shanks mangas in existence, as well as the total number of cases opened. Now, I knew someone was going to ask in the comments if I knew what percentage was pre-errata and what percentage was post-errata, and so what I did here is I looked actually at the Luffy leader. I looked at the pre-errata submission rates and the post-errata submission rates, and 46.7% of the total submissions were pre-errata, suggesting that around 46.7% of the total boxes opened were pre-errata. Now, I do want to caveat that, though, because the pre-errata ones are worth significantly more than the post-errata ones, which means that in all likelihood, a higher percentage of those cards have been graded than the post-errata Luffy, and so the real percentage of pre-errata boxes is likely smaller than 46.7%, but I don't really have any way to specifically calculate that. All right, so moving on to OP02, we have the Ace. My estimated population for the Ace manga here was 5,230, which converted to 15,900 cases. Now, when I did this analysis, I had no idea what the result was going to be. I did not know whether this was going to be a video, whether it was going to be interesting enough to share, but it turned out that the results were actually quite similar using the same methodology across different sets, which I thought was really, really interesting and potentially validating for the overall approach of looking at these estimates. Now, moving on to OP03, we had to do something a little bit different here because the Soga King manga is just not as popular as either the Ace manga or the Shanks manga. And so what I did here was I lowered it to the lowest serialized card rate, which was 33%, And miraculously, when I did that, the result came out exactly the same as OP02, almost, with 15,900. You can see that the population estimate here is 5,238 for Soga King and was 5,230 for Ace, which I thought was fascinating. And again, I think suggests that there may be some validity to this approach. So moving on to OP04. OP04 was tricky because unlike the previous sets, the Sabo manga is not the most expensive card in the set. And so we used the BOA SP to try to calculate what the print run of these sets were likely to be. But because it's an SP and it's not a manga, again, we're looking at a situation where we likely have a lower percentage of the population that has been graded by PSA or BGS than we have for the mangas. But at the same time, the BOA SP is probably more popular than the Soga King manga. I ended up splitting the difference and multiplying the population by 2.5 to arrive at 6,795 for the estimated population. Now, there's a slightly higher population of these per number of cases opened than the mangas, because while the mangas were pulled at a rate of 330 per 1,000 cases, this SP was pulled at a rate of 400 per 1,000 cases, which meant that we had to change the math a little bit. But ultimately, again, I chose 2.5 without knowing how many cases that was going to show, and the total cases that we got from this was around 17,000, which again is fairly consistent with what we saw in OP01, OP02, and OP03. Now, OP05 is where things get really, really complicated. I looked at 3 different cards to try to assess this, and 2 of the cards, the Oda Signature and the Luffy Gear 5, came to shockingly similar results. So again, I multiplied the existing population by a factor of 2, and that gave us 5,390 of the Oda Signatures, 4,212 of the Gear 5 Luffys. Now first, that reinforces what we've talked about in a previous video, that the Oda Signature is likely a less rare card than the Gear 5 Luffy. But when we then translated that into the number of cases opened, the Oda Signature came to 38,220, and the Luffy came out to 38,290. And so I split the difference, but again, the results of analyzing those 2 cards were shockingly similar. I also included the Nami here. I have a lot less confidence in the assessment of the total number of Namis in this set. The estimate from her was around 36,000. So again, we're taking all of this with a grain of salt. I don't know for sure that exactly 38,000 cases have been opened, but all 3 of the cards using this approach landed in the same ballpark of showing that there are probably double and maybe even more than double of OP05 that's been opened compared to the previous sets. So even though in the previous videos we've talked about how the Oda Signature and the Gear 5 Luffy are some of the hardest cards to pull, their population is actually a lot higher than one would expect given how rare those cards are, because the total number of cases open for OP05 is really, really high. Lastly, I wanted to look at EB01, and there's been a lot of conversation for a long time about how rare EB01 was. I didn't doubt that it was rare, but I had no idea how rare it actually was. When we did the analysis of Chopper, we multiplied the existing population by 2, and we got a total population of 2,576 Chopper mangas, which converts to approximately 7,800 cases opened of EB01, which is both around half of what we expected from the earlier sets, but also is pretty much in line for pre-errata OP01 number of cases opened. In my opinion, after doing this analysis, I think that this is a quite rare set, and that the hype in terms of how rare this is actually justified. All right, so if we compare the number of cases that were opened, here's what we see. Now, for the purposes of the analysis, I think what I want you to take away here is that OP01 pre-errata is likely the rarest. EB01 is way rarer than the other sets. OP01, 2, 3, and 4 are pretty similar, and OP05 is way less rare than the other sets. Now, moving on to the analysis of the specific card population, I think the biggest takeaway here is that although the Luffy manga and the Oda Sig are way harder to pull, because of the population report, the Chopper manga is actually the rarest card across these 6 sets, at almost half the total population of the Luffy manga. But even with the large population of OP05, the OP05 mangas are actually the second rarest still rarer than a normal manga. Then we have the Ace, the Soga King, and the Shanks, all with pretty similar populations. And then we have the Oda Signature Luffy having a very similar population to what you would expect from a normal manga in a normal set. Then we have the Boa SP with a slightly higher population than a normal manga. That tracks with what we expected. And then we have the OP05 Nami SP, which even though it has the same pull rate as a normal manga in sets 1 through 4, because there was so much more printed, the population of this is quite high at 11,000. So the main things I want you to take away from this are, number one, main sets seem to have consistent print runs, while special sets vary quite wildly. OP01, 2, 3, and 4, for the most part, the print runs were pretty similar, while EB01 and OP05 were at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, with EB01 having a very low print run and OP05 having a very high print run. The second thing I want you to take away from this is that print run actually matters a lot for rarity. I haven't finished them all yet, but I am going to go through and I'm going to do this for the rest of the sets to the extent that I can. It's going to get a lot harder to do this for the modern sets because the graded card population isn't going to be as accurate, but I'll do the best that I can to try to give you other sets so that you can really compare apples to apples here, because even though the pull rates for some cards may be much lower in other sets, if the total print run population, the number of cases that were opened, is much higher, then they're going to balance out, and we may have cards that end up being of similar rarity. Finally, I want to reiterate this again. These are estimates of the number of cases that are opened. Number one, they're estimates, right? I use an approach that I think is justifiable, but I don't know for sure that these are the correct answers, and I want you to treat them accordingly. But also, this is an estimate of cases opened, not a total estimate of cases printed. So if you're looking at the question from a sealed perspective and asking, well, is OP05 sealed product less rare than OP01 sealed product? I don't know the answer to that question. It's possible that some analysis could be done in the future to try to estimate which sets were opened at higher rates and which sets were opened at lower rates, but the truth is I don't have any information on that, at least at this point. And so that's all I have for you today. I hope this was helpful. If you're enjoying this content, please like, subscribe, keep engaging in the comments. The response has been tremendous. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one.